This is the Ag Queen Podcast. This podcast explores the agriculture industry with the movers and shakers of those shaping it. Here's your host, Lori Boyer.
Welcome to the show. Dr. Robert Johansen is joining me today, and he is the Director of Economics and Policy Analysis with the American Sugar Alliance. It's been a little while since you and I have talked, and the last time we did talk, you had just started in that role, and so we learned more about what you would be doing there. And how long have you been with American Sugar Alliance now?
Seems like forever. No, I'm just kidding. It's been just over 3 years, about 3.5 years now, since the beginning of 2021. So lots happened in agriculture over that time period, but it's been a really fun time here at the Sugar Alliance. And now we're in the midst of Farm Bill, so that's keeping us busy. But you've got the general, every year you've got the planting. We're in just, the beginning of the growth of the crop now for beets, of course. And then, I was keeping an eye on the world markets and what's going on in economics. So there's no shortage of work to be done. I'm curious what I said when we first talked about what I'd be doing, but it's been a really good time.
You represent both cane producers and sugar beet producers, right?
Yeah, that's right. We represent all the American-based sugarcane production. So that now is in Louisiana and Florida, as well as 11 states that produce sugar beets. And we do have some of those companies also have facilities that are on the seaboard, such as in San Francisco, Baltimore, New York, and Savannah, Georgia. So we do have a presence of refining in some other states, in addition to the crops that we grow in sugar beet states, as well as the sugar cane that we grow in Louisiana and Florida.
All right. Well, as you mentioned, everybody's just on a holding pattern when it comes to the Farm Bill, unless you're aware of some of the insider things that we're not aware of. Any new information on that?
Well, I'm sure you guys in the media are much more apprised of, what's being said by different members. We always, I think, in general, knew that once the political season got going full steam, that it was going to be hard to see members focusing on different things other than just the election that's coming up in November. So I think there was a push to try and get support and momentum behind the Farm Bill this spring. And I think we saw a lot of progress being made on different versions of the Farm Bill draft, whether that's in the House or the Senate. So I think the committee's got a lot of really good work done. But I think things are kind of on pause now until the election cycle is complete. And then I'm sure, of course, that doesn't mean that something couldn't happen as legislation moves. But generally speaking, we're supportive of getting a new Farm Bill done to sort of meet some of the new economic challenges that producers are facing for sugar beet, sugar cane, but as well as other commodities. And if it doesn't happen now, then I'm sure there'll be a lot of support to get that moved after the elections, or whether that's in the lame duck section or with the new Congress.
Dr. Johansen, what are things that the American Sugar Alliance is working on in addition to monitoring those two issues?
Well, like I mentioned, we're kind of finishing up the marketing year for last year's crop, and we're seeing the new year crop go in. And so one of our activities that we spend time at is keeping track of where USDA is forecasting the upcoming crop, and that's important for all of our farmers and our businesses to know how to plan for the upcoming marketing season. So this year, we're looking at crop year. We're sitting on about a 9.2 million ton domestic crop of sugar. That's sugar cane and sugar beets. We are importing a fair amount of sugar from about 70 different countries. As I probably pointed out before, the U.S. is the number 5 sugar producer in the world and the number 3 sugar importer in the world. So both of those things are important for us to keep track of. This coming year, with the new crop in the ground for the beets, USDA forecasts a record crop of 9.3 million tons. Kind of one notable thing. So again, we're looking for a good crop in Colorado, as well as a record sugar beet crop for for the U.S. as a whole this coming year. Now, as you know, there's not as much concern this year around the sugar beet planting states with drought as there has been in the past. There's been a fair amount of moisture. There has been quite a lot of moisture in the Red River Valley, where we see a majority of sugar beet production in the U.S. So, drought isn't an issue, but we're hoping to see more or less rainfall actually right now in that area, which is a contrast with previous years. It's been fairly dry in a lot of the sugar beet states, and so we've actually looked for more moisture. This year is on the other side of the coin with respect to that. But the crop's looking good, and we're looking at a record crop if all goes well for the rest of the year. In sugarcane, we did lose a state. We produced sugarcane in Texas last year. They are not producing sugarcane this year, so that's a change. In terms of the overall production number, there are more acres planted in Louisiana this year, so that should make up for roughly 20,000 acres lost in Texas. And that was related to a dispute that we have with Mexico over irrigation water supplies that they're by treaty obligated to provide the districts in the Rio Grande Valley in the south part of Texas. And so they haven't been delivering their obligated irrigated water supplies for that region. And so that's why after a couple of years of dry weather down there, the growers just weren't able to see a feasible way to continue growing sugarcane, which needed irrigation water in that region. Now, of course, in Colorado, you have a lot of irrigated sugar beet crop, but also some non-irrigated sugar beets. So as you know, if you don't get that irrigation water and you're counting on it, it makes it difficult to see how to continue. So anyways, that was one change that we had from last year. In addition, as I mentioned, we're constantly monitoring regulatory changes at USDA. Usually that doesn't affect sugarcane or sugar beets all that much, but that's something we keep track of as well, keeping an eye on the tariff rate quotas as announced at USDA, and they're moving along that as usual. No real surprises there. One last thing that I'll just note before I see if you have any other questions is we have our largest trading partner is Mexico. They usually ship over 1 million tons of sugar to us each year as part of our suspension agreements with them. Last year and the year before, they had terrible drought, so they weren't able to actually ship as much sugar as they could have. Again, this is something we're keeping an eye on this year. A lot of those relationships have been formed with regards to our companies that refine Mexican sugar for customers. So they've had to turn to other countries to get additional supplies when Mexico is unable to deliver. So just knowing how the Mexican system is performing is important for us to keep track of as well. So let me stop there and turn it back to you to see if you have any questions on any of that. What we saw with COVID is kind of interesting. We saw a lot of inventory building going on during the COVID year, during sort of 2020, 2021, 2022. Food manufacturers were uncertain, not necessarily for sugar, but for other commodities where they would be able to get their supplies from. So they built up, inventories of both product as well as raw supplies. And so we did see a bump in sort of industrial demand for sugar in the U.S. during those years as those supplies got built up. Now we're back to a more normal, there's no supply chain bottlenecks right now. Those companies feel more comfortable going back to just-in-time delivery for their supplies. So they're unwinding some of that inventory that they had built up. So we are seeing a softening on the industrial demand side a little bit. It's not much, by and large. I would just say that overall sugar demand going into 2025 is roughly the same as it was in 2024. If you look at total use, it is down a bit, but the reason for that is because we're not expected to ship sugar to Mexico this year in the amount that we did. As I mentioned, I think just a second ago, Mexico had a terrible drought last year, so they actually imported some American made sugar into Mexico. That's not normally what we would expect to see. Usually the flow goes the other direction. So this coming year, we're expected Mexico won't need to import from the U.S. and therefore overall use of sugar will be down a little bit, but domestically speaking, in terms of demand, it's about the same as it was last year. In terms of prices, what we've seen is the world market has sort of flattened out at a level of about 19 cents per pound on the world market for raw sugar. That keeps the U.S. price about roughly 38 cents a pound in the U.S. Now that's down a bit from a high that we saw back in November when prices were about 44 cents for raw sugar. So it's down from that, but it's at a sort of a plateau level right now. We don't expect that to really change this coming year. Looking at the fundamentals from world supply and demand, we're expecting to see generally either a small surplus or a small deficit in terms of the world balance sheet. That means the prices, barring any unforeseen, supply shock due to weather, we're not expected to see real big changes in the world market going forward. And that means that the U.S. price will probably be pretty stable too at that 38 cent to 40 cent range for raw sugar. When it comes to refined sugar, of course, and beet sugar falls into that category, it's pretty well linked to that raw sugar price. So a little bit higher than that when we look at wholesale price for sugar that's being sold around the country. We don't expect to see too many changes, and that's sort of hovering in the 45 to 55 cent range, depending on where it's being delivered to and how far contracted in advance it is. So I would say just a stable market looking forward, and looking at a good crop generally means that overall expected to see increases in our revenues going forward.
All right. Good information. We are out of time here today. I want to thank my guest for joining me, Dr. Robert Johansen. He is the Director of Economics and Policy Analysis with the American Sugar Alliance. I'm Lori Boyer.
Thanks for tuning in to this edition of the Ag Queen Podcast with your host, Lori Boyer.